This is History for Cocktail Parties with hack historians Thornton Kennedy and James Ottley.
Welcome back. This is Thornton Kennedy stepping in from the home studio. Now James and I have gotten to Jekyll Island. We are kicking off the final episode on the plan that emerged. Some call it the creature from Jekyll Island. Here's James Ottley to talk about the no-name club's solution to the banking crisis.
This was the Aldrich Plan and basically was repackaged as the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. I want to just kind of go through it real quick, kind of the structure, because again, and then we can kind of get into the juicy conspiracy stuff. 3 sections of it, 3 main parts of it. You've got the Board of Governors. You've got the system of 12 regional banks. They were careful not to use the word bank or central bank, and they said
Federal Reserve,
it's a system.
Right.
It's not a central bank, it's a system. And the Federal Open Markets Committee. So starting with the system of 12 banks of the Federal Reserve, there's one in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Richmond, Atlanta, Chicago, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and each one is separately incorporated with a board of directors, its own board of directors. So each of the 12 reserve banks, they've got 3 classes of directors, 9 total. Class C is appointed by the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C. That's one of the 3 sections to represent the public. Class A and B directors are elected by the member banks in each district. And I wonder if the Class C designation, which is controlled by Washington, D.C., whether they made it Class C to kind of make it seem less significant.
Right.
I don't know. I have no idea. There's probably a good reason for it. Each of the reserve banks, they have the following duties. They participate in the formulation of monetary policy, operate a nationwide payment systems. I'm not going to go through all this, but they hold the reserve balances and serve as the lender of last resort, which we talked about last time.
The previous iterations had not had that function.
Well, yeah, American banking system did not have that function. That's what Warburg was talking about when it's like each bank had its own little pail of water, and if there was a fire, they hoarded that pail of water rather than sending them all to the front, or the troops that are all garrisoned in little separate garrisons, but never combined to go actually fight at the front. So it did provide for the Fed being a lender of last resort. Okay, back to the Board of Governors, which is again one of the 3 sections. This is kind of important. The Board of Governors is located in Washington, D.C. It's a lot of Washington, D.C. power. It's an independent federal agency that oversees the Federal Reserve System. The president appoints 7 of the members, subject to Senate confirmation. Their sole responsibility is for setting the reserve requirements for the banks. That's pretty big. Yep. It controls how much money is in flow. And it approves the discount rate, which is the interest rate charged for short-term loans in between these banks. Also very important in terms of controlling the economy. A lot of control in Washington under the Board of Governors, one of the 3 main sections of the Federal Reserve. So now we can get to the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the 3rd section, and that's where it kind of gets interesting.
Gets a little wonky.
Indeed. So the Fed's principal monetary policy making body is the open market operations. Is this, and its most important tool is working with buying bonds and selling bonds on the open market. There are 12 voting members, 7 members. Again, this is the D.C. control here. 7 members of the Board of Governors are controlled or appointed by D.C. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank, he's one let me start again. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is one of the directors. New York Wall Street control. Then a lowly 4 directors are actually bank presidents. So most of the control on the Federal Open Market Committee is in D.C.
New York.
or D.C. and New York. So, and I think that's kind of imperative. So here's how the Fed creates money, and here's what gives rise to the conspiracy theories in that, they're creating money. They are creating money out of thin air, but they don't literally print money, but they do create it out of thin air. Bear with me here. This is where it really...
We're with you. We're locked in.
All right. This is where it gets good. If you understand this, you can understand the Fed. All right. The U.S. Treasury decides it needs $10 billion to fund the government for the week. So it holds an auction to sell government bonds. These are basically promises to pay, just like you think, IOUs.
So far, I'm with you.
Okay. Good. Major banks and other large financial institutions purchase these bonds from the Treasury with real money from the depositors that's in their coffers.
Right.
And that's important. It's actual real money. It's already in the economy, and that's how they use that real money to purchase these bonds. So the Fed, depending on how much money it wants sloshing around in the economy, decides to buy or not buy or sell some or all of these bonds from these major banks and institutions, buying them on the open market. Again, the federal
so far,
open
you're doing
market.
a great job.
Fantastic.
Let's keep
So
going.
this is where it gets a little bit confusing. So the
we're going to lose Thornton.
Fed, well, hopefully not, because but it is kind of tough to understand. So the Fed literally creates money to buy these bonds from these big banks who've already bought them from the Treasury, and they don't print dollars. They just do an accounting entry and send a wire transfer, and it's real money once it gets to the bank, but it's been created out of thin air at the Fed. And if you think about what is a wire anyway?
I have no idea.
Do you know?
Wire.
I don't know. I don't know that many people do, but to borrow from Seinfeld, the Fed does, and they're the ones sending the wire. So
well played.
So let's say the Fed decides to buy all of the $10 billion of bonds from the banks have bought from the Treasury. So the banks, if the Fed does that, the banks have their coffers replenished with $10 billion of new created money. It was just created out of thin air. But again, it's real money, to the banks. And so now we get to phase two.
That was just phase one?
That was phase one.
How many phases are there?
Well, we're getting there. So, and I know that I promised there would be no math, but again, bear with me. All right, so the Treasury gets its money because the big banks have put real money and bought the bonds. They then sell those bonds to the Fed. But the Treasury gets its money. Postal workers and actually the postal workers get their paychecks. Maybe the folks that make $10,000 toilet seats, they get their money. But let me just jump back. I actually had a few more things to say about the bond buying process. So the U.S. Treasury has $10 billion in its coffers from the bond sale. The big banks now have $10 billion in their coffers. The Fed has a $10 billion IOU, this bond sitting in their vault now. They bought it from the banks. So the U.S. Treasury is flush with cash. It starts paying its postal workers. The Department of Defense starts buying, $10,000 toilet seats, and the money goes out into the economy and then gets deposited in the banks. The big banks, with the $10 billion that they just got for selling the $10 billion of bonds, they have that money back refreshed in their coffers. And so they start lending that money out, 90% of it. They keep 10%. They can lend 90% out. And, they use $10 billion of depositors' real money deposits to buy the $10 billion of government bonds. If you'd stopped right there and they weren't replenished by the Fed, have I lost you?
You have completely, but keep going. Just because you lost Thornton, that means that 80% of the people who are listening are still with you.
Okay. Well, let me say that again. So the big banks, they have sold their bonds they bought from the Treasury. They've now sold them to the Fed. The Fed has created money to buy the bonds from the banks. So with created money. So the $10 billion that they got, if the Fed hadn't bought it, if there was no Fed, the banks, it would have just stopped there. The $10 billion from their depositors, they'd given it to government, the story would have stopped there. You're like, I wish it stopped there. But it keeps going. But the banks now have this $10 billion back in their coffers. They've been replenished. So they can start lending that out, 90% of it. They keep 10% and they can lend out 90%. And so, they have this $9 billion to lend out. And so, the Fed, by creating this money, has put more money into the economy. And as more money goes into the economy, I think we all know each dollar, is less. So the Fed creates the money to buy these bonds. That causes inflation. The fewer bonds they buy, there's less money in the economy and less inflation. So that is phase one. That's one way they increase the money supply and unfortunately create inflation in the system. And that is where we're going to get into this money multiplier effect that I started to talk about, the phase two. This is the phase two.
All right, we're on to phase two.
We're getting close to the conspiracy part. So phase two, the postal workers, they start to get their checks, and the toilet seat makers, they start to get their checks, and, they deposit these checks in a bank, at least for a while. So this is in addition, of course, to the $10 billion, that the bank has gotten back and is lending out $9 billion. So you've got, the money that's back in the big banks, replenish their coffers, and you've also got money with the Treasury. Now, to make the numbers easier, let's just look at, say, $1,000. $1,000 of this $20 billion. Okay, that's now sitting in the bank. So the bank.
That sounds like Thornton money.
Okay.
Maybe $10, but we'll stretch it out to $1,000.
To $1,000. All right. So, and this is the money multiplier effect. So the bank keeps 100 of that 1,000 in the vault and lends out 900. The depositor that put the money in has $1,000. It's FDIC insured, and the guy that borrows the 900, he's got his 900. So ta-da! Now there's 1,900 in the economy when before there was just 1,000. And so the borrower with the new $900 loan, at least for a while, he most likely deposits that $900 into a bank. The bankers love this. So, and that bank then repeats the process.
Wow!
It gets $900. It keeps $90 in the vault, and it lends out $810 to a new borrower. That original $900 borrower has $900 in the bank, the $900 he borrowed, and the new borrower has the $810, and then he goes and puts that in the bank. And here again, from that step in the cycle, you've got 1,007.
Promised me there'd be no math.
Well, so I'm not going to go through all 28 steps, but it usually takes that process usually
there are
repeats.
28 steps.
We're not going to go through. My point was
you're about to hear a door slam.
So the point is that that's the money multiplier effect, and it takes usually about 28 steps or cycles of that deposit and relending for that to play out. So $1,000 after it gets deposited, relent, creates $10,000 of money in the economy.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So just $10 billion, not just
okay. Extend it out to what would be a normal
becomes $100 billion. So the Fed's really got to be careful. It's a Pandora's box. Any money that they create, it's not just that money. It goes on and on and on and on. All right. So here's
the reserve system is kudzu in your backyard.
So here's kind of the counterpoint or the conspiracy theory. So even though the Fed is not purchasing the government bonds directly from the government, that actually I'm told is not legal. They're using a middleman, which is the big banks. But the government bonds are ending up back, in the Fed. So the Fed's created money is funding a large part of the government's debt, even though they're using a middleman. So by increasing the money supply to buy these bonds that are increasing inflation, our purchasing power goes down as inflation increases. In a sense, we have something taken from us when the value of our money and our savings goes down. I want to quote Thomas Jefferson, who was talking about paper money.
It all goes back to Thomas Jefferson.
Indeed. Paper money and inflation in the Revolutionary War. He says, everyone through whose hands a bill passed lost on that bill. What is lost in value during that time, that was in his hands. This is a real tax on him. And in this way, the people of the United States actually contributed those millions of dollars to the war effort during the war, and by a mode of taxation, the most oppressive of all, because it's the most unequal of all. And so because the Fed money is created, and this money is then used by government bonds to fund the government, and the increased money supply causes increased inflation, the conspiracy theory is, or the counterpoint is, I'm not going to say conspiracy, the counterpoint is that this is a hidden tax.
Right.
Do you follow me?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's interesting.
So that's, and if the guys, the team that went to Jekyll Island knew that they were creating a hidden a way to raise taxes
in fund secret, the government without having to tax, without a tariff.
Exactly.
Just by putting money into the economy
in
and
a way,
having this nefarious system that creates more money, which is the multiplier.
In a way, the money multiplier fact, I mean, that just is what it is. Right. But the creation of the money, which then leads, through the money multiplier effects, is Pandora's box. If they knew that, then it had to be a secret meeting. In addition to everything else that we've said.
So it's not necessarily that Nelson Aldrich was a pariah. It's that they were doing something incredibly nefarious, which was setting up another. And let me say that this is a Thornton Kennedy insert. I know for a fact that the reason that the Federal Reserve is not being targeted by some of the cuts that are going on in the government right now is because it funds itself. It generates a lot of money for the federal government. So Elon Musk is not knocking on the door of the Federal Reserve because it's a cash cow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's theoretically independent
it is.
of the government, even though it has all that government control. Maybe this team of bankers knew exactly what they were doing, creating a means whereby the government could obtain instant purchasing power without taxation. And, that's the theory. Here,
let me insert this as well. These were all really smart human beings.
Absolutely.
They were some of the sharpest minds in the country. Harvard economics professors, people who'd studied banking. Paul Warburg was a really sharp cat. Mm-hmm. So perhaps it would be almost insulting to say they didn't know what they were doing.
Exactly. And, it also didn't hurt that all that money went back into banks.
Right.
That they could lend out at interest and more interest and more interest. But I think that, whether you think that it's a conspiracy theory and whether they knew that they were creating a way to, raise a hidden tax. Yeah. I think that kind of depends on, just what you believe, your worldview, and, how much you trust the Fed and the government. But again, if they were intentionally doing that, it kind of, adds even more reason, for them to keep it secret. So anyway, what after they got back from Jekyll? Aldrich.
Well, that is a big story. We're going to get into what happens to the bill.
No, just very short, just to kind of, it was known as the Aldrich. Don't worry.
You got Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party.
No.
We are going to go off on another tangent.
They put forth the Aldrich bill. Warburg said, hey, we should not call it the Aldrich bill because everybody hates you.
Right.
We should call it the Federal Reserve Bill or something like that. And it's kind of interesting to note that it was the first time in our history that paper notes of a banking institution became legal tender, not only for public debts, but for private ones as well. So you have to accept their money.
Right.
I mean, just like today.
Interesting.
And so, as I said, Warburg wanted it called something else. The bill went nowhere. Stiff opposition. Aldrich was voted out in 1912. Woodrow Wilson, Democrat, was elected in 1912. There is a great story with the Bull Moose. We're not going to get into it.
The Republicans split into two halves. Actually, the Republicans, if you include Bull Moose plus Taft, they actually get more votes, but Wilson wins because it's split.
That's right. So Wilson gets in office. He doesn't fully understand it, but and there's a little bit of conspiracy stuff too that the bankers were, had him in their pocket, funded him at Princeton, et cetera, funded his governorship run, all of that, and his run for the president. So anyway, the irony is that here's the party of the working man, the party of Thomas Jefferson, formed only a few generations earlier for the specific purpose of opposing a central bank. Now supporting. All comes back to your original point.
Outstanding. That is outstanding.
I knew you'd like that.
I love that.
All right, so how has the Fed done? How have they done?
I will say that since 1913, the one thing the Federal Reserve has done really well is that we have not had any deflation. Value of U.S. currency has remained on an upward trajectory. Yeah. However, it was founded to prevent events like 1907, right? That was I think we'd had one in 1893 as well.
That's right.
There had been these huge downturns that really impacted American life. After 1903, you have the Great Depression. I think in 1918 there was a downturn after World War I. So you had instant impact of depressions, recessions, the Great Recession of 2007, 73. You had a recession in 1981. So whatever the Federal Reserve was set up to prevent did not prevent those things from occurring. And what I find most interesting, again, is going back to my time, 2008, when the world got upended by this the credit-backed mortgage
securities
stuff. That was almost a carbon copy of what happened in 1907 with the big panic. You replace Bear Stearns with Union Pacific. You replace Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac with the crash of copper prices and New York City bonds. Lehman Brothers with the Knickerbocker Trust Company, AIG with the Trust Company of America, and you would precisely mimic the 1907 panic. So, did the Federal Reserve do what it was set up to do?
Who could say?
Who can say?
Yeah. Seems like every 20 years, people forget the last depression or the last recession, and it starts all over.
Correct.
Human behavior,
Human behavior.
Every generation throws a hero off the pop charts, right?
Well played. Well, James, this has been a fantastic ride. I've loved getting to Jekyll Island with you. This has been awesome. I think that we've got a lot of great information here. It's been a pleasure.
And I think that, the end result of kind of the takeaway, now that we've reached, finally, the end of our story.
Maybe. The problem with History for Cocktail Parties is that we do go off on tangents.
Absolutely.
Although we stayed pretty disciplined this round.
Or is that a problem?
I don't think so.
Yeah. So we're at the end of a story. Was the Jekyll Island meeting convened under a cloak of darkness? Was it a conspiracy with bankers and government and cahoots to provide for a hidden taxation and unlimited government funding? Was it just necessary to keep this meeting secret because Aldrich was an unpopular, powerless figure who sought the counsel for banking reform from Wall Street bankers, an equally unpopular group, and was forced to work up a plan away from the public eye, because he had no other alternatives? Who can say?
Well, I think we've got a pretty compelling background on all of it. Awesome. Well done. Thank you for listening to History for Cocktail Parties with hack historians James Ottley and Thornton Kennedy. Please like and subscribe. And now that the episode's over, you can go pour yourself another round, and we'll catch you next time.